So I'm going to talk, as Dennis said, about a Christian response to climate change. I'm going to specifically talk from my own faith position as a Christian, but of course I should say that the issue of global climate change affects the globe, of course, and it's one that affects many different faith groups. We could look at different faith groups' response to it if we had time, but we won't today. But I think Christians and faith groups are in a unique position, actually, because we have networks which are international. I know a lot of Christians support overseas workers and support aid in foreign countries. So, of all people, a Christian community actually has an entree to this issue, but many secular organisations don't, actually. So I think that's a strong reason, amongst many others that we'll talk about in a bit, for Christians to be engaged with this topic. Well, when I was, a little while ago, I was asked to give a talk, Should Christians Be Green? Not a title I chose, and actually I said no, they shouldn't. They shouldn't be green, which slightly shocked the person who'd invited me. And this is a reason, because green issues are one, I think, of many issues that Christians should be addressing. And of course, like any single issue things, we don't want to go overboard on one issue to the detriment of others. I do think, as the Bishop said, that we've been rather laggardly, actually, in getting on the environmental issue, because after all, we believe in a creator God, and we live in his creation. And I think through the latter half of the 20th century, we left the running really to, I'm saying this on film, slightly nutty tree huggers and the like. So I think, we've got a lot to make up, but I'm glad to say that people are. Should Christians be green? I said no, they shouldn't. They should actually be multicoloured. There should be a lot of different issues that we're addressing at once. But I do just notice, if you remember the colours of the rainbow, red, orange, yellow, green is right in the middle, blue, indigo, violet. You can also tell we had a very wet holiday in the Lake District. Well, I'm going to divide this talk into two halves. The first half I want to talk about science, and I hope I won't be repeating stuff the Bishop talked about in that score. Secondly, I want to talk about some theological issues of how we should respond as Christians to some of these problems, which are very 21st century issues that have come up. Obviously, in general, not things that have been faced before. So I'm going to start on scientific issues. And climate change is a big threat. Sir David King, who's the government's chief scientist, described it as a bigger threat than terrorism. And Sir John Houghton, who was formerly head of the Meteorological Office in Britain here, called it a weapon of mass destruction. Climate change was a weapon of mass destruction. One other area that I just wanted to draw attention to is that it's obviously an issue that should be uppermost in the minds of Christians, of people of faith. But interestingly, this book by E.O. Wilson was published just earlier this year, I think, or late last year. Now, he's a secular humanist in the States, very prominent, one of the most famous living biologists today, probably. And he wrote this book, which is an appeal to a mythical Southern Baptist pastor in the States. He's American. And what he says essentially is to these Christians, he says, look, you care about creation, I care about creation. There are about 30 million of you in the States and a few tens of thousands of us secular humanists. Why don't we get together and do something together on this? That's his message. And it's very striking that it took an official atheist to issue that message to Christians. But I think he's right. It is an issue that faces all of humanity. It's an issue on which we can have common cause with many other people, not only other faith groups, but other people who care about this world. So I think it is an important issue. And you probably know some of these statistics. 11 of the last 12 years are the hottest on record ever, globally. 98 was the warmest year on record globally, ever, since it's been recorded. 2006 was the hottest year on record in Britain and the USA, and Britain has the longest continuous temperature record anywhere in the world. We've been recording temperatures for 347 years. The issue actually is not just the increase of temperature, which is about 0.7 of a degree, which you might think is not very much, but we'll come to that in a minute, but that the rate of change is higher than it ever has been before on the Earth, as far as we know, and certainly it's going outside bounds that humans have ever experienced on the Earth, ever, in their entire history. So that's why it's an important issue. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, issues very authoritative reports every 4 years or so, and they've just issued this year their 4th report. This was a group of people from 100 nations, thousands of scientists in complete agreement. So it's a very strong report. And for the first time ever, in their last statement, they said that the warming of the climate system is unequivocal. Now, they're very careful in the terms they use. So they use very likely means statistically 90 to 99%. And likely is below that, and possible is below that. But unequivocal is absolutely unequivocal. The Earth is warming, it is unequivocal. Well, as I say, there's been about 0.7 of degrees C rise during the 20th century, which may not sound much, but the difference between an ice age and not an ice age is only of the order of 6 or 7 degrees. So this is a significant part of that. And actually we're in between ice ages now, so it's taking outside the realm that we've ever been in before. Well, here's a plot of the variation of the Earth's surface temperature, the average Earth's surface temperature over the past 1,000 years. There were bigger errors as you go back further, that's why those grey bars are bigger. But there's no doubt, if you look at the recent record, that it's just rocketing up on the right-hand end of that scale. It's, as I say, about 0.7 degrees. If we just blow up the last couple of 100 years, 150 years actually, there's an interesting thing to be seen here, because if you look at oops, let's just go back. If you look at this blue line, which is the average temperature, it goes up, it comes down, it goes up again. And there are a few groups of people, climate deniers around, that say, well, you know, it's not really warming up as much as you think. Now, I have to say that the climate deniers get much more publicity than the vast bulk of people, and scientists particularly, who have no question about this. And that's because the media loves to have conflict, you know, I think it makes a better story. And they will point at this graph and say, look, the heaviest period of industrialization in the high-income countries was just after the Second World War, in the 40s and 50s. And blow me, you say you were making lots of carbon dioxide then, but look, actually the temperature goes down. So there isn't any correlation, really. You know, you're talking, I was going to say you're talking hot air, but maybe say you're talking cold air. But actually, it turns out that there is a very simple explanation for that. And along with that heavy industry making lots and lots of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, it also made lots of pollution, which we know all about. And pollution puts particles in the atmosphere, and they reflect sunlight, and they actually cause cooling. I mean, some of us are old enough to remember that people were frightened of nuclear winters if there was going to be a nuclear holocaust, that we'd all freeze to death. And interestingly, what happened through the 50s and 60s, well, 60s and 70s really, there was a lot of effort to clean up the pollution, Clean Air Acts and so on, both in North America and in Europe. And actually we're seeing the effects of that in the temperature rise, the underlying temperature rise, which is happening now. So we've got rid of the pollution, we're actually seeing the underlying trend more strongly. I mean, some of us also are old enough to remember the smogs that used to be in London. This is the year I was born, 52, and in 1950, 4,000 people died in a single London smog one weekend. You know, it wasn't uncommon. And of course, you get none of that now. But I like this picture because Monet was around at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and he was very accurate in his colours. So scientists have actually looked at this painting of the Houses of Parliament, and they know where he was living. They can work out what time of day it was from how high the sun is and where it is, but also something about the pollution from the colours he used. And you know, this was getting on for midday, and it was pretty murky in London. So it turns out that this dip here was due to pollution from particles, and from the 80s onwards, it's just been rocketing up ever since, and each year is hotter than the next year. Well, I think in common parlance we all know that this is happening. We've been experiencing very warm weather in Britain, which statistically it might be. It does go up and down statistically, but if you look at something like glaciers, they reflect the long-term change, because there's a lot of, it takes a lot of heat to melt a glacier. That's why the ice in your drink actually lasts quite a while as ice. Or actually, even the worst example is frozen turkeys. I don't know if you've ever bought frozen turkeys for Christmas. You know, and on Christmas Eve you suddenly think, help, it's still frozen. What do? You know, you try putting it in the bath, it doesn't work. try putting it in the, I've heard people do this, they try putting it in the dishwasher on the heat cycle, but I do not recommend that because that's a way to get salmonella. But it takes a long time to thaw a frozen chicken, and those of us that have had that problem will know that. Glaciers take a long time to respond, so they lag behind the temperature change, but they are responding. Here's a picture in Argentina, taken in 1928, and the photographer went back to the exact same spot and took a picture in 2004. And you can just see how much of the ice has gone. And for Europeans, here's a picture from Austria, taken in 1875, standing in exactly the same place in 2004. The ice is gone. So I could show you many, many examples of that. The ice is showing the response to the longer term temperature change. Well, what causes global warming? I'm not going to give you a highly technical answer, but the first thing I want to say is that actually global warming per se is not a bad thing, because if there weren't global warming, the Earth would be about 30 degrees centigrade colder. It'd be about -16 here today, and life as we know it would not exist here. The Earth would be completely frozen all over. That's mostly due to water vapour and some carbon dioxide. So global warming is a good thing. The issue at the moment is that we're suddenly releasing huge amounts of carbon, which has been locked up underground in oil and gas and coal for 100 million years, and we're burning it very, very rapidly. So we're throwing all this carbon dioxide into the air very, very quickly. And somebody's estimated that we're throwing 1 million years worth of accumulation of carbon into the atmosphere every year at the moment. And the atmosphere may eventually sequester this carbon dioxide, or the Earth system may sequester it out of the atmosphere into soils and so on, and into the oceans particularly. But it takes 50 to 100 years to do that. The carbon dioxide will reside on average for about 100 years in the atmosphere. And that's the issue, that we can't get rid of it quick enough. It's the rate of change that is the problem. And the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has increased from about 280 parts per million pre-industrial times to 386 parts per million now. And the government's talking about trying to hold the temperature rise to less than 2 degrees. That's about 450 parts per million. We're getting quite close. So it turns out that carbon dioxide is, of all the gases, carbon dioxide accounts for 2/3 of the global warming. But methane, although there's not much methane around, it's much more virulent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, about 10 times worse. And so it actually does account for about 1/4 of the greenhouse warming. And that's significant because if you count how many cows there are in the world, it turns out that there's 1.7 billion cows in the world. It's a bit delicate just after lunch, isn't it? But they produce methane from both ends, actually. And it's been estimated that they produce 500 litres of methane per cow every day. I mean, it's a huge amount. And that accounts for 18% of the greenhouse warming on its own, which is more than all the transport sectors of the world put together, all the buses and trains and airplanes and cars and ships put together. I mean, it's very significant. And one of the interesting things, therefore, is do we need so many cows? Now, I gave this exact same talk a little while ago to a Faraday group, and one of the ladies came up to me afterwards and she said, well, thank you for your talk. You know, I'm from Wales, and my daughter's just gone to work for this small charity just south of Oxford. It's only got half a dozen employees. It's called Send a Cow, which I've read about, actually. We got one in the leaflet from them, just, I think, with the Evangelical Alliance booklet just the other day. Well, of course, they're doing something different. They're sending cows, which then provide sustenance for an extended family with milk and so on. But there are many places where forests in South America are being raised down to provide grazing, to grow beef cattle for people to eat in North America and Europe. And it takes 10 kilograms of vegetable protein to make 1 kilogram of animal protein. It's a very inefficient way of making meat. But one of the very striking things that happens as people get richer, somebody was just saying this to me at lunchtime, I think Gordon was, that over recent decades we eat much more meat than our parents used to. Every day, twice a day, maybe 3 times if you have a cooked breakfast. And the thing that happens in a rich country, in a country that's developing fast, like India, when you get rich, you buy a Mercedes and you start eating steak every day. So certainly this is something that struck me. So we're not vegetarian, but it's given us a bias towards vegetarianism because it does have a very big impact, interestingly. Is humanity responsible for global warming? Another question I'm often asked. And the answer is, here's one answer anyway. This is a thermal imaging picture of the Houses of Parliament. And red colours are hot and blue colours are cold. The Times ran a headline with this saying it's proof that the Houses of Parliament are full of hot air. That's one answer. The other answer, the more technical one, is if you take all the natural inputs to the climate system, and that includes volcanoes which throw out all sorts of stuff, and El Nino and El Nino and all these other things, and you try and model it with computer modelling programs, which are very sophisticated now, and this is the result of several hundred of them from different places, the bands. And then you plot on what the temperature change actually has been. This is for the last 100 years. It doesn't fit. Well, it doesn't fit for the last 30 years or so. The actual observed temperature is going way above what you would predict. But now, interestingly, if you put into those models all the gases produced by humans, carbon dioxide and methane and so on, it actually fits rather well, as that pink curve shows. Well, there's just one sort of indication that humans are responsible. That's, I could talk about other things as well. If we look back a bit further, and we look back through the last ice age, here's the temperature changes for the last 160,000 years. And this was a temperate period, this was an ice age, and we're in a temperate period now. Actually, the change here is about 10 degrees between, or a bit less than 10 degrees, 6 degrees perhaps, between the ice age and the temperate period. These changes are caused by variations in the orbit of the Earth around the Sun. They're called Milankovitch cycles, and they're very well known. They've been known for 100 years. And they occur on a 100,000-year timescale and also on 450,000-year timescales. If we now plot carbon dioxide on the same scale, which I'm doing here in red, you can see that it mirrors the temperature change very precisely. Temperature is high, carbon dioxide is high. Temperature is low, carbon dioxide is low. But of course, you can't really see what humans are doing on this timescale of 160,000 years. So I'm just going to blow that up in a minute. But this is what it's doing. It's just going vertically up on this scale. We're up to about here now. If we double what it was pre-industrially, which people is a sort of target people are aiming for, whether they'll achieve it, I don't know. If we just carry on as we are now, carbon dioxide is going to go up here. But already it is way above the limit that the Earth has experienced. In fact, not just for the last 160,000 years, but for the past 650,000 years. And we know that quite well because we've got cores through ice that go back to 650,000 years, so we know what the data is. And humans have only existed over this period. So it's gone outside the range that humans have ever experienced on this Earth before. Now, I can't talk about this without talking about global population as well. There's a very striking plot here, if I just show you. If you look at humans since, well, what I like to think of as the time of Adam and Eve, since Neolithic times, 10,000 BC. Look what the curve looks like. Really, nothing much happens until now, and then it just shoots up exponentially. Well, you can't see that, so I'm going to blow up this right-hand side. There's about 6.5 billion people on the Earth at the moment. And it's growing so fast that there are about 3 times more, the population of the globe is 3 times more now than it was when I was born. And there's all sorts of other statistics. More than half the people alive today are children. They're under 18. More people are alive today than have ever lived in the entire history of humankind, because this is an exponential curve. I mean, if you want anything to illustrate the harvest fields are ripe, and you should go into them, here is a plot to say that. It's estimated that we'll probably end up with something like 11 billion, we're about 6.5 billion at the moment. And the only reason for that is that as people get more affluent, they tend to have fewer children. Certainly in Britain, the indigenous population replacement is below, the number of children is below replacement rates, so our population is only increasing because of immigration. So, you know, the hope is that we will get there, but that's double what it is now already. So I have to say that this is one of the main factors that's loading the Earth, and we shouldn't ignore that. You'll be glad I'll get off the science soon and talk about some theology. But let me just show you what carbon dioxide is doing. If we carry on as we are now, I showed you up to here, we'll go up to a very high value indeed. If we try really hard to reduce our rate of increase of fossil fuel growth, which there's no sign of us doing in the high-income countries yet, we'll still end up with this more gradual increase. If we try really, really hard to cut down so that we actually reduce by this blue line here, the temperature changes with the same colours for these three scenarios are shown here. So business as usual will have an increase of 5 degrees, and most people reckon that 2 degrees is when things get really serious, and we're at 0.7 degrees now. If we try reasonably hard, we'll still go up 3 degrees. If we try really, really, really hard, that blue curve, it's still going to go up, because stuff we've done already has to feed through the system. Sea level is going to keep on rising for the next 300 years as the heat gets propagated through the ocean. And other factors like that. It will take 100 years to scrub the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere that's already there. So this is why it's a serious issue. We can't just suddenly turn over a new leaf and it will go away. So the sins of us will be visited on our grandchildren. The moral issue is that a sixth of the world's population, that's us, North America, high-income countries, produce the bulk of the greenhouse gas pollution, whereas the sixth of the world's population, which is living on pretty well less than $1 a day, produces only 3%, but are the ones that will suffer because they're already living on the edge, and so this might just push them over if it gets hotter or if there's drought, if there's floods. That's the moral issue. Well, one other point I want to make is that global warming is not just the temperature. It actually also causes more extreme weather events, and that's particularly floods and droughts are one of the issues. And I don't know if you know this, but floods are certainly the main killer of people. Katrina may or may not have been due to global warming, but even a high-income country like the States couldn't respond to that very well. Even in England, 7 people died in Gloucestershire, where Gordon comes from, in the floods this summer. But if you live somewhere where you're living on the edge already, you don't have much chance. 2003 was extremely hot in Europe. There it is just there. It was well above the expected trend. Although the trend is going up, and by another 20 years' time, that will be the norm. Well, something like, it's been estimated that 20,000 additional people died in France, mostly in Paris, in that summer of 2003. And mostly very old people or very young people for whom that heat stress was too much. But as I said, floods are one of the world's main killers, and I don't know if you know this, it doesn't always hit our consciousness that on the 13th of November 1970, more than 500,000 people died from floods in Bangladesh. Isn't that shocking? 500,000 people died from floods. And that's not the worst. China has had some wickedly horrible floods. 1887, the Yellow River, something between 1 and 2 million people died. Again in 31. Maybe as much as 3.7 million. It's hard to know because of communications with China are not very good, of course. But it's been estimated that through the 20th century, floods affected 100 million people. But interestingly, because people are moving into big cities out of rural communities, because big cities are always on the coast or in river valleys, because they're by the water, it's estimated that even by 2025, which is not very far away actually, that half the world's population will be at risk from floods. And floods and extreme weather events are a natural consequence of global climate change. And the patterns will change, so the things we are used to experiencing in our particular part of the world will be different. So we may not cope with them, particularly if we haven't got resources. I mean, if we live in England, we can build a higher Thames barrier. If you live in Bangladesh, where 30 million people live within a metre of sea level, you can't put a barrier around the delta because it's a deltaic area. And again, it's been estimated by the middle of this century there'll be something like 200 million environmental refugees fleeing their countries because of the effects of climate change. And we fight wars over countries, over boundaries, don't we? We fight wars over land boundaries. So if your land is no longer tenable for living, this is a whole new situation we've not been in before. Now, I won't see how alert you are after that lunch. I'm sure if you're like me, you're not all that alert. But
There are some iconic pictures that we have to be careful about. Iconic pictures. This is an iconic picture of the poor old polar bears getting marooned at sea with the melting ice in the Arctic, which has certainly gripped the imagination of North Americans. But I think a High Court judge in Britain looked into this recently and said, well, actually, as far as is known, only 2 polar bears died from drowning by this effect. But if I was to ask you, let me just do this test. If you think of an iconic picture of the Vietnam War, what do you think of? This one?
That's it.
Yes, Kim Phuc, 1972. Now, interestingly, this was a case of friendly fire. The US forces had dropped napalm on a South Vietnamese friendly village. So it's not all it seems, actually. But it has become an iconic picture. And I suppose, you know, if the polar bears are an iconic picture, we just have to go with it. But don't mix that up with the reality of what's happening, because that actually is not the main issue. Okay, let's talk about some theological issues then. And I want to make 3 points, really, for the background theology, and then I'll talk about some application to our real lives. And the first one is that the Bible is quite unambiguous that God created the heavens and the earth. It says so in the very first chapter, very first verse of the Bible, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So that immediately cuts across, you know, all the New Age thinking, or all the thinking of the time about the myths that humans were just the fallout of battles amongst the gods, or that the gods made humans to be their slaves, that sort of thing. God created it because he chose to of his own free will, and that's that. He didn't have to, but he chose to do that. And actually, the very first verses of John's Gospel say the same thing. John 1:3, through him, that's through Jesus, all things were made. And just in case you didn't get the message, it says the same thing the other way around. It says, in fact, nothing that's been made was made without him. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. So the Bible seems pretty clear that God created the world. Probably something most of us would assent to, but you know, that is an important underpinning. And as I say, it was in contradiction to many of the myths around at the time, which I'm sure Gordon will tell us more about, like the Gilgamesh myth and so on, when he talks to us, Gordon Wenham, later. Second thing, so God made the world of his own free will. Second thing, God's creation is good. And again, if you look at Genesis 1, you can't help but notice that, because verse 4, God made the light and he saw that it was good, it says. Verse 10, he made the sea and the dry land, and God saw that it was good. Verse 12, he made the vegetation, the plants and the trees, God saw that it was good. 18, he made the sun, moon and stars, and God saw that it was good. You know, the message seems to be, well, I could go on and on. Every time he's finished a day's work, God said that it was good. And then at the end of this created episode, he looked at everything he'd made humans as well by this stage, and in verse 31, God saw everything that he'd made, and it was very good. So we can't really fail to get the message from Genesis 1 that God's material creation is good, right? That matter matters to God. And I think that's a really significant point. It's maybe a similar point to what the bishop was making this morning, that Christianity is a very materialist religion. It's rooted in the real world. It's rooted in the material world. God came to earth in a specific place in the Middle East at a specific time. It's solidly rooted in that. So there's no place here for the sort of religion that says, especially the Eastern religions that say, you know, we should try and subdue the physical in favour of the spiritual plane and trying to attain a higher and higher spiritual plane. So, as Dennis said in the introduction, Christianity has its feet firmly on the ground, which of course I like since I'm a geologist. So God said unambiguously that he made the world, that it was a good world, and God gloried in his creation, you know, and in turn his creation. Sorry about that. Let me just. Now you know that's coming. His creation reflects something of his glory. What I'm just going to play you is something that's little known, actually. This is to wake you up, actually, as it did with Rodney. He jumped quite a long way. Maybe he wasn't asleep. But he wasn't quite asleep. This is a clip from the Apollo 8 mission, which was the first mission to go around the moon.
It had 3 astronauts, Lovell, Anders and Borman. They were up there over Christmas 1968. And some of us are old enough to remember picking up and listening to these things. On Christmas Eve, 1968, they interrupted all their communications with Mission Control in Houston, which are mostly really boring, numbers and pressures and amounts of fuel and angles that they should orientate the spacecraft and so on. And they were about to do an incredibly critical thing. They were the first people to orbit the moon. They were in orbit, and they were going to round the back of the moon, out of contact with the Earth, manually orientate the space module, fire the rockets manually on a stopwatch to get themselves out of orbit from 70 kilometers, I think it was, above the moon, or might be 70 miles, very close to the moon anyway. And it was an incredibly risky thing, actually. I mean, privately, some of Mission Control thought there was only there's a 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 chance that it might not work. It did, as we know, so that's all right. But shortly before doing this, they were coming around the front of the moon. It was Christmas Eve, and they said to Mission Control, we'd like to read you something, is that all right? Mission Control said yes. And the interesting thing is, what they chose to read were the first chapters of Genesis. So sit and listen. It's quite loud at the beginning. It's quite hard to hear, but it gets a little bit better as you go on. Because remember, it was analog technology in 1968, and it was coming a 250,000 miles from the moon.
For 20 minutes, the astronauts cataloged the mountains and craters they were passing over. Then, as they approached the moon's dark side, they began to read a passage they had selected from the Bible's book of Genesis, the creation story.
For all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void. And darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the water. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God called the light day. And the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day.
The thing about Apollo that sets it apart from every other event in the history of exploration is that human beings could share in the event as it was happening. We felt the awe and the wonder that these 3 men were experiencing so far from their home planet. Look at the step we were taking. And in that moment, they were touching base with the most fundamental narrative we have, the creation story.
And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good.
I've never seen this place so quiet. There was a big hush in here, and to tears in a lot of eyes. It was just the perfect thing to do at the perfect time.
And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
Well, quite a finish for this last transmission from the moon of Apollo 8. From their television cameras there, 230,000 miles from Earth, some 70 miles above the surface of the moon.
Well, I don't know about you, I find that incredibly moving, considering the circumstances they were in. There's an interesting codicil to this, actually. There was a Japanese reporter in Houston covering the moon mission, and she rang up the publicity officer for NASA and said, oh, that was a great speech they made. Can you give me a transcript of it? Because they didn't have tape recorders And he was obviously on the ball, this publicity officer, because he said, "You're staying in a hotel?" I said, "Yeah, I'm in downtown Houston." And he said, "Well, if you just look in the bedside table top drawer, you know, page 1, you'll find it." So God created the universe, chose to do so, it was a good world. Just the third point I want to make is that God sustains the universe continually. The picture the Bible gives is that he's upholding it moment by moment. So Hebrews 1:3, Jesus is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. Or again, if you look at Colossians 1:16, for by Jesus all things were created, we've seen that already. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So the picture here is of God's upholding the universe. It's as if he chose not to do so, it would descend into chaos. You know, he's purposefully holding it together. Like if you're watching a program on TV, you know, you can get engaged with the story, the narrative, and so on. But if you lose those electrons that are firing moment by moment to make a picture, it just descends into a massive black and white dots, into chaos. So that's the picture that God has. He made the universe, that God gives. He made the world, it's a good world, and he sustains it moment by moment. He's engaged with it. So there's no place here for this cartoon. God created, this is called the Big Break theory, God creating the universe and then leaving it to its own devices. It's not like that. It's God upholding it moment by moment, being engaged with it. Okay, so that's just some very sort of basic background theology. What about a Christian response in the light of that? Well, the first thing is that if God cares for this world as much as he said he did, then so should we. So, you know, if we neglect it and spoil it and don't care about it, we're not only damaging something that's precious to God that he made, but we're also, in a very real sense, preventing the created order from reflecting God's glory fully. And I think that's why Paul talks about creation groaning and waiting for the sons of God to be revealed, because somehow we're marring that image, we're putting it out of kilter by the dissonance of our sinfulness. And it's, you know, to take a sort of human example, it's if we wreck the world we live in, it's like the teenage children when their parents have gone away for the weekend having a party and trashing the place that their parents have lovingly created, which actually happened around Easter last year, didn't it? Christopher Patten put it this way in his Wreath lectures. He said, not from a Christian perspective, but he said we should care for the world, but we should live here as though we were intending to stay for good, not just for the weekend. That's another way of putting it. Well, another thing about God is that he really cares for his creation. We'll come to the place of humans in a minute, but if you look at Psalm 104, for instance, the lions roar for their prey and seek their food from God. It's quite clear that you know, this order is something that God's chosen to use. Or if you look again at Psalm 147, he covers the sky with clouds, he supplies the earth with rain, he makes grass grow on the hills, he provides food for the cattle and for the young ravens when they call. So, and there's many others that you could think of too, that God is caring for his creation and he's looking after it and sustaining it in a way that makes it possible for us to live here. I actually also think it's part of his grace to us that he's created a universe that's understandable, that's consistent, that we can investigate with science, and that we can therefore use for the good of humankind, or for the ill of humankind as well, of course. But I think that's part of his grace towards us, that we live in that sort of universe. I mean, here's one more example. The grasslands of the desert overflow in Psalm 65. The hills are clothed with gladness, the meadows are covered with flocks, and the valleys are mantled with grain. They shout for joy and sing. This is a place, actually, that he's talking about here, with no humans in it. I know we sometimes think that humans are the pinnacle of creation, and if you read Psalm 8, then certainly you get that impression, you know, what is man that you're mindful of him, the Son of Man that you care for him, yet you made him a little lower than the angels. And yet there is also this trend right through Scripture of God making a world which, even without humans, is something he cares about and he looks after, that reflects his glory in some sense. Well, God cares, so we should. That's the first point. The second point is that God actually commands us to look after it. That's pretty straightforward. In fact, it's the first commandment he ever gave us in Genesis 1:27. He gave us a command to care for, in 1:28 actually, to care for the world. just before he did that, interestingly, we're told that he created humans in the image of God. So we might just tease out what that means, and people have written volumes and volumes about it, but for sure it includes a number of things that separate us out from humans, even though from animals. Even though we share 98.5% of our DNA with chimpanzees, we are more than just animals. We are animals as well, but we're also made in the image of God. And I presume that includes things like being able to relate to God, to have a loving relationship with him, to love and be loved, to be creative. You know, God flung stars into space, it says. He created millions and millions and millions and millions of stars just for the joy of it, in one sense. Humans can be very creative too. I think one of the most significant things is that we're moral beings. We have a real sense of justice, and all of us know if we've been done an injustice. There's no question about that. We live in a moral universe, and one of the things we all long for, you know, is for the end of time when the judge of all the universe will come back and put things right, things that are wrong. So the very first command that God gave humans, made in his image, in Genesis 1:28, God blessed them, that was part of it, and then he says to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, and over every living creature that moves on the land, on the ground. That's pretty unambiguous, to have dominion and rule over. Now, in a sense, stewardship is part of that, but it's stronger than stewardship. It's putting order in as well. And I guess it's a bit like the picture of a garden. If I hate to say this, but if your garden is a bit like ours, that we don't quite spend enough time in, you know, the weeds take over, it looks pretty messy quite quickly. And to make it fruitful, to make the vegetables bear fruit, the flowers to bear beautiful flowers, you have to have dominion over it, you have to order it. And I guess that's one of the senses in which God is commanding us to rule over the earth and its resources. Well, as I say, that's the very first command he gave us, and it's pretty unambiguous. And interestingly, this being made in God's image, I think, is part of that rule. In 3rd century BC, people the kings used to put up images of themselves around their borders, as if to say, this is me, I rule here. Well, in the same sense, God has put humans on the earth in his image, and we are supposed to rule in his stead, in his place, in the way that he would rule. We're supposed to be co-regents with him, which after all is what we'll do in heaven. We'll rule in heaven, it says, with Christ. And that actually takes away all the issues that some people have raised in the past, that when Christians have been given a command to have dominion over the earth, that's given them permission to rape and pillage and do what they want. That's not the image the Bible's giving. The image the Bible is giving is of ruling over the earth in the way that Christ himself would rule. And you know, the picture he uses of himself most commonly is of a shepherd king, a pastor pastoring his flock. You know, we should be ruling over the earth for the sake of others, not for the sake of ourselves, not to enrich ourselves, but for the good of humankind. And in order to worship God, that is part of our worship of God, to rule the earth properly and to allow it to be fruitful and to allow it to reflect his glory in the way he intended. So we should be vice-regents, if you like, on his behalf in the way that Christ was as a shepherd or a servant king. Calvin said this actually in the 16th century, let everyone regard himself as a steward of God in all things which he possesses, then he'll neither conduct himself dissolutely nor corrupt by abuse those things which God requires to be preserved. So if you're on the ball, you'll be noticing the sermon outline here with 3 C's so far. God cares, so we should. God's commandment to us to look after it. And the third thing I want to say is that it's part of our care for our neighbour. If what we do is deleterious to our neighbour, albeit they're in sub-Saharan Africa, then it's a bit hard for us to say that we're loving the Lord our God with all our heart and all our soul and all our mind and all our strength, and that we're loving our neighbour as ourselves, isn't it? If what we do makes life really hard or even untenable or even causes people to die, not only on the other side of the world but in future generations, then I don't think we're loving our neighbour as ourselves. So I think that is a real imperative on Christians to take action, quite apart from what other people might or might not do. I think Richard Charters, the Bishop of London, put his finger on this about a year ago. Do you remember he said that
making selfish choices such as flying on holiday or buying a large car are a symptom of sin. And that completely puzzled all the papers, partly because they misread it. They said they read it as saying flying on holiday or buying a large car are sinful, which isn't what he said. He said it's a symptom of sin. And I think he's right in the sense that obviously it's right sometimes to fly, to have a car, and so on. But actually, if you do that for selfish reasons, that is what a definition of sin is. Sin is turning our back on God, and therefore saying, my will be done, not thine. And so he was exactly right that these can be a symptom of sin. And interestingly, he was, I don't know if you listened to the Today programme this morning, he was being interviewed on the Today programme at 7:30 this morning, because he's just finished his year where he said he wouldn't fly anywhere. And I know that included going to a meeting in Transylvania that Dennis was at as well, and he said it took him 36 hours to get there, and 36 hours to get back on buses and trains and so on. And actually he said, yes, sometimes it stopped him doing things. So one invitation he turned down was to go to an Earth Summit meeting in the Arctic.
James instead.
Oh, did it? Did
Yes.
James go? Oh, what a pity he's not here, eh? Because he said that would have taken him a week to get there if he hadn't flown. I didn't know James had gone. Well, here's some of those consequences. I mean, there's many consequences, and flooding and so on is one of them. But people have tried to sort of estimate, and these are hard numbers to estimate, but just the indication is right, that if the temperature increases above 2 degrees, and this is 3 degrees here, that's all, the risk of water shortage for people goes up hugely. So there could be 3 billion people at risk from water shortage. Things like, 1 billion people in India get their water supply from the Himalayan glaciers. If they're gone, their water supply's gone. And that's why I said 2 degrees is a critical temperature. Also, the risk of flooding and increased temperature. If you're living on the edge already and you're sort of living in a marginal environment, then you can get ill more easily. And I know these look quite small because they're down at the bottom, but there's still hundreds of millions of people. Here it is blown up here. The risk of malaria, risk of hunger. There are still hundreds of millions of people once you get over 2 degrees. And indeed, it's already affecting people. This was a publication in Nature, which is the preeminent scientific journal, in 2000, looking at trying to estimate how many deaths have been caused by global climate change. And again, as I say, these are difficult numbers to put your finger on because, what's to say they wouldn't have got malaria anyway. But the interesting thing is the red colours are people more at risk. And look where the people at risk are. They're in Southern Africa, Asia, a bit of South America. The green are where it doesn't really make much difference. North America, Europe, Australia. The people who produce all the pollution are in North America, Europe, Australia. The people who suffer from it are in Asia, Africa, South America. That's the issue of justice, the moral issue. I don't often quote Margaret Thatcher, but I do on this. She was very prescient in raising issues of the environment in the 80s, in fact. She said, we don't hold a freehold on our world, but only a full repairing lease. We have a moral duty to look after our world and to hand it on in good order to future generations. Well, if I had just stopped my talk here, you would say that, Bob, which universe are you living in? We had a talk on multiverses yesterday. They might think I'm living in one of the other multiverses if I say creation is very good and just talk about this aspect of it. Because, of course, our world, from a Christian viewpoint, has been spoiled by sin, by our own rebellion. And this really is where I want to bring a specifically Christian perspective, because much of what I've said about our response so far would be shared by, all right-thinking people. Yes, of course, we should do something about climate change. Of course, it's the poorest and the least able to respond that are affected by it. But there is a specific Christian message of hope, which the secular world doesn't have. And that specific issue is that this world, which is out of kilter now, is somehow spoiled by sin, it's marred somehow, it's groaning, as Paul put it in Romans 8, will in the fullness of time be perfected in the new creation. That's a clear message of the Bible that you have to accept. And the new creation has every sort of image of it as of a place where things are right, where God will come down to live with his people, where we live now is sort of a preview, in a way, of what it will be like then. Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is here now, so there is a sense in which we should be behaving towards it as we will through all eternity. This is the passage I was quoting just now from Romans 8, that creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God. So this restoration of new creation, new heavens and new earth, will be not just for humans. It won't be us floating around on clouds playing harps with sort of silly nighties on. It's for the whole of creation to be restored and made to be how God intended it to be in the first place. Now, there's two aspects of this that I want to talk about before I draw to an end. There is obviously a discontinuity between this creation and the next. There are differences. The only person that's come back is Jesus. When he came back, he had a body that looked human. He could talk to people. He ate fish and so on. Whereas that continuity, he bore the scars of something that had happened at his crucifixion, in fact, on earth in his resurrection body. But there was also a discontinuity. You know, it was different. He could walk through walls, through locked doors. He appeared and he disappeared. And I presume that's true of all of us in the new creation. And interestingly, Paul addressed this because some people are asking him, how are the dead raised? What kind of body will they come with? And Paul's answer, I mean, he's a fairly robust guy, was Paul, and he didn't cut corners. He said, that's a stupid question. Well, he didn't quite say that. He said, how foolish. What a silly question. That's a foolish question. And he drew this analogy. He said, when you sow, you don't plant the body that will be, but just a seed, perhaps of wheat or of something else. But God gives it a body, as he has determined, and to each kind of seed, he gives its own body. So the wheat seed grows into corn, or the little acorn grows into a great oak tree. There is a continuity between them. I mean, we would say with the modern view that it's got the DNA built in there, and so on. But there's discontinuity. It looks different, you know. It appears different. So there's continuity and discontinuity. Well, how should we behave in the light of those new heavens and new earth? Luther said this. He said, if I knew Jesus would return tomorrow, I'd plant a tree today. In other words, we should be modelling the kingdom of heaven now. The things we do now should be in expectation of the things we'll do for all eternity. And there are other verses that talks about this. For instance, the glory and honour of the nations will be brought into heaven. That's certainly talking about the best endeavours of this world will in some sense carry through. The new creation will have cities. You know, they are places of human, you know, the city of Jerusalem. That's a place of human construction. Cities, animals don't build cities. So there's lots of issues like that, continuity and discontinuity. But it is a specific Christian hope for the future, and I think that's a distinctive thing that marks Christian attitude to these issues out from the secular attitudes, which often are sometimes defeatist, but sometimes apocalyptic in the sense of, oh, it's terrible, what can we do? You know, what impact can we have in Britain when we only account for 3% of the pollution? The Christian hope is hope for the future. The President of the Royal Society, Lord Rees, is Master of Trinity here in Cambridge, put this interestingly in his annual address of last year. He said, even in a cosmic or a geological time perspective, he's a cosmologist, I'm a geologist, he said there's something unique about our century because for the first time in its history, our entire planet's fate depends on human actions and human choices. And I think Christians ought to be at the vanguard of these sort of issues because we're a community, we care about these things, we're a global community in fact. C.S. Lewis often made very quote-worthy comments, didn't he? And here's one of them. He said the Christians who did most for the present world were precisely those who thought most of the next. He said, if you aim at heaven, you get earth thrown in. If you aim at earth, you get neither, he said. I think that's quite a good thing to remember. So, in conclusion, I want to say the 4 C's here. This is at least an outline of a Christian response. God cares about this world, so we should. God commanded us to care for it, to have dominion, to steward it, so we should. It's a practical way of showing care for our neighbour, and is specifically Christian hope for the future. So perhaps these 2 points that I want to make at the end. There is a distinctively Christian attitude underpinned by hope, and Jesus said that he came to make all things new. So we should have faith not that things can be different, but that things will be different. And Jesus said he was going to make all things new. He didn't say he was going to make all new things, did he? So we need to work in this world because Jesus gives eternal meaning to that world, to that work. And secondly, the Christian view is holistic, so we should care for the material as well as the spiritual aspect, realities in this world, because that's what we are. We are people. We're not people without a body. We don't exist without a body. So we should care for God's creation in a manner that shows our love and obedience in that way. And those of us, I think, who live in high-income countries, who have built our standard of living on the back of use of carbon, profligate use of natural resources, I think we've got a particular imperative, a particular responsibility in our stewardship to care for those elsewhere in the world who are marginalised by climate change. I'll put that up anyway. So I think I'll stop there. A colleague and I, Nick Spencer and I, have just published this book just a couple of months ago, and that is for sale outside. Just before I stop talking while I've still got the stage, let me say that I haven't talked about practical things you can do on purpose, because if you start saying you must do this, you must do that, you mustn't do that, that is not the Christian response. It's not meant to be a hair-shirt response. The Christian response is one of hope for the future. But of course there are practical things we have to think about. And a really good booklet is one Tear Funder put out called For Tomorrow Too. And I've put some of those on the bookstall. If you want to take them back to your parishes, I've got 250 of them, so just come and ask me, I can give you a bundle to take with you. That's got a lot of practical details of things you can do. If you want to know scientific questions, some things that people say, but climate change isn't occurring because of clouds or because of sun cycles or whatever. The Royal Society, just a straight scientific booklet, have answered 10 common comments about controversies about climate change, and I've got some copies of that if you want. And thirdly, I wrote a small paper, Cambridge paper earlier this year, on Christian care for the environment, which I'm happy for you to take a copy of it. There's some just on the rubbish bin here by the door, so pick one up on the way out if you'd like one. Okay, I really will stop there.
Thanks very much indeed, Rob. Right, so get back there. Get back in the middle again. We'll go straight into questions time. Question in the back, yeah. So.
Bob, thank you very much for a great talk, and also for your book, which I've read. And I'd like to draw you out about the Christian response that you suggest in your books, with a question to you: is it strong enough? So my argument is this, that Stern in his report attributed climate change as one of the best examples of market failure. And so the argument really is that part of the problem of climate change has come about because of the economics that we have. And if one looks, for example, at Northern Rock over the last month, there were two things that I think are important about that. The first is that it was bailed out by public institutions, not private institutions. And secondly, it was caused by a global network banking. So what happened in America has trickled right through to Europe and so on, so that we are part of a global system which one can say, if you look at poverty, for example, that global system hasn't worked. The vast majority of our people in the world have not enough food to be sustained by that global system. And given that therefore there is a market failure, then it seems to me that one of the responses of the Christian community is to highlight that as a key, not the only, but a key factor in how we move to a new created Christian vision of society. So, I mean, we need to change our light bulbs and things like that as well. But simply looking at the big picture, I'm wondering whether one of the key aspects for a Christian vision of the new creation is to start to think, what is the kind of new economic system that we have to put in place? And allied with that is, if you're going to have a new economic system, you have to have a new set of international institutions. The World Bank and the IMF have failed, and we need to start to put together new institutions that will protect the commons and protect a new economic system which is based on justice, science and ethics. Would you like to respond?
Would I comment on that? Yes, a number of things to say. Of course, the failure of Northern Rock was due to human greed, and a lot of the issues I've been highlighting today are due to human sinfulness. There's no question about that. And it would be better if we lived in a world where there was justice. There's no question about that. But equally, we do live in the world we live in, and so we've got to find ways to respond to that. And I think the interesting thing about the Stern report, he was an economist, put out a report just about a year ago, and his tack was exactly as you say. The free market has not done anything about this problem. Can't cope with it. And there's two responses really. And one interesting response he said was, look, if we carry on like this, it's going to cost us between 5 and 20% of our GDP in the future. So it's worth investing 1% of our GDP now on energy saving measures, on changing what we do, on life, the way we make energy and so on, because you'll save money in the future. And I think that's quite a powerful argument, because it speaks to to anybody of any faith or none. You'll save money, and most of us like to save money. Now, the interesting thing is, why don't we do that? Why don't we use low energy light bulbs? I'm not sure whether these are in here. Why don't we use low energy light bulbs in our own homes? Because you save money. And interestingly, last night at the dinner, I was sitting next to a Nobel Prize winner, right? A physical scientist and astronomer. He knows how to do numbers. And I said this to him, why on earth don't people buy low energy light bulbs? You save money. He said, oh, I don't think you do. I went into the shop the other day and the low energy light bulb was £2.50. Well, actually, it's a bit of a geeky thing to do, isn't it, sitting at dinner? But I went through this calculator. If you leave a 100-watt bulb on, electricity for 10 hours a day, which we might do in our hall, electricity costs 10p a unit. Over a year, you'll spend £36. £36.50 to be precise. If your light bulb, a low energy light bulb costs £2.50, you use about a sixth the energy. So you'd use about £6 of energy plus your £2.50, that's £8.50. You save yourself money after 3 months, that's all. If it's on 10 hours a day, it might only be on 5 hours a day, in which case you save yourself money after 6 months. If it's only on 2.5 hours a day, you save yourself money after a year. And generally, these low energy light bulbs have much longer life than incandescent ones. And here was an intelligent man who understood numbers, who hadn't even addressed that. So I think part of the issue also is education. Just people understanding this issue and doing something about it. But I think the third thing, I just picked this up from you, we're not going to change the economic order of the world overnight, but I think Christians can actually speak into this. And the issue about climate change is that it's a long-term issue. It's 10 years, what we're doing now will affect the world for 10 years, 20 years, 100 years hence. And it's very hard to get politicians to do anything that doesn't affect the little patch they live in over the next 4 years, because they get elected every 4 or 5 years, and that's primarily what they care about. But if the populace says, we want you to do this, then they'll do it because they want to get re-elected, to be crude about it, to be slightly cynical. And Christian communities are a very powerful lobby, actually. And I think if we all write to our MPs, if we all start modelling some of these issues, actually we can get political change, certainly on climate change, but also on some of these other issues to do with poverty and GDP and so on. I think it's scandalous that the amount that Britain gives to overseas aid is 0.8%. And we signed up to a UN agreement years and years ago to say we'd give 2%, I think it was. We give 0.8%, and most of that is tied to using a British company to build a dam anyway, whatever it is. There are many things that we can lobby for if we actually get educated and do it. And I genuinely think that, as communities, we should do that, because we are a very well-networked community. We have a global community of Christians. We have local communities, national communities, global communities, and many of us know what's going on. We're in prayer groups for East Asia, or we're giving money to Tier Fund for aid in Sub-Saharan Africa, or whatever. So I think that's why I think we have a strong part to play into the political process, as well as the practicalities of what we might do ourselves. It doesn't answer everything, but I think those are the pragmatic steps we might take.
Next question. Yes,
Just the question of the apocalyptic element.
Yes.
You haven't sort of put that in perspective. Would you like to do that as you see it?
Apocalyptic, I mean, apocalypse means a revealing of something which is there already.
Sorry, I was showing the eschatological sense of expecting the return of Christ.
Yes.
And the sense of the judgment that would be associated with that within a context of hope as we have it. And that's the emphasis. But we may not be able to do what we would like or not achieve what we would like, because within that perspective we may find that we're not as successful as we would like to be because of that very point.
At the present day.
Yes.
Yeah, well, of course, that is all our experience. I mean, it was Paul's experience, wasn't it? That he was a chief of sinners, he said. You know, he was, which perhaps just meant he was more aware of his sinfulness the longer he lived the Christian life. And I think there's always this dichotomy, isn't there, that you know, if you're a Christian, you're supposed to become more Christ-like day by day by day, but also we become more conscious of our sinfulness day by day by day. So I think there is that issue that, you know, we do live in a fallen world, and there is a limit to what we can do. We shouldn't get discouraged because things aren't suddenly rosy, because Jesus never said they would be. You know, he said this will be hard work living in this world. And Christians of all people shouldn't expect to avoid suffering and pain. I mean, in some senses, maybe we should expect it more than others. In some senses, we should expect to be rejected and hurt more than others if we stand up for Christ. And the New Testament is full of that sort of aspect of it. But on the other hand, you know, that's not a reason not to try and do what is right, to try and do what will please God, which is what our worship of God is, isn't it? And, you know, we worship God by doing what He requires of us. And I think it's actually pretty clear what we should do. And mostly we spend our time finding excuses not to do it, actually. So, you know, I'm with you there that it's hard work and we'll never see the fulfillment in this life. And I don't for a minute believe, you know, either that things getting worse will mean Christ will return, or things getting better will mean He'll return. We just don't know when He'll come back. Jesus didn't know Himself, so we don't know. We just have to live day by day, you know, as if we are living in the kingdom of God, I think, in the best way we can. You know, and we're all very poor, you know, we're very poor at doing it, but we should try. I think is the answer. Is that fair?
Yes, question for Frank, yes. Yes, please.
Thank you.
Yes.
May I push you a little further on markets?
I always say this is my co-author, which is true, in fact. But anyway,
right. It's very easy to knock the markets, but it is arguable that if markets are allowed to function properly, and if they're properly regulated, and if they do factor in all the true costs, all the true resource costs into their transactions, they are actually, and have been shown to be historically, an extremely efficient way of bringing material welfare to a very, very large number of people. And that the problem we've seen in, say, the last 50 years is that markets haven't been allowed to work properly as good functioning markets. Far too many states have not created market economies. Far too many markets have been obscured by strange practices. But if they were allowed to work properly, they would actually could deliver unprecedented levels of welfare and far higher levels of welfare to more people than the inevitably mismanaged attempts by governments to act as proxies for markets, which I would regard as one of the great disasters of the last 50 years in certain parts of the world.
Okay, well, there certainly are those aspects of state intervention in markets, but let me just put this point to you, which is that none of our market costs at the moment factor in the environmental cost of the resources. We're using resources from the earth for free. We're not paying the cost of them at all. And it has been estimated that, for instance, every tonne of carbon dioxide we use, because of the damage it causes, we should be paying £100 per tonne because of the damage. And you can make the same calculation for copper and iron ore and uranium and everything else. And the fact is that in our markets at the moment, the raw producers do not pay any cost at all for the damage. If we factor that in, then I think the market system would work much better.
They're not factored in, so they're not actually providing true costs.
Indeed.
But if they were factored in, they would be much better markets.
Okay, well, I'm absolutely in agreement. And then things would work much better, I agree. Yeah, absolutely.
But I don't think we should throw away the baby of the bathwater of markets, with the bathwater of inefficient markets.
Well, in our book, actually, because it's written by the in conjunction with Jubilee Centre, and the person who leads that used to work for the World Bank, I mean, he's quite in favour of markets in the way you say.
Good.
But with safety nets for the poor and so on, and using some of that wealth to support those who can't. Perhaps another point I should make, just in passing, which I didn't think of just now, is that at least the biblical view is that a lot of things should be done more locally in communities, and I'm sure we'll start to see that. So, you know, savings banks, it's good if they're local. There's a Cambridge Building Society, which is great because it takes money locally, it uses it money locally, it gives it out locally. And I think that the Northern Rock issue is partly because we've taken money from somebody we can't see and you forget about them. You know, we're disconnected from them. And then what we do with that, we don't see the impact on the people that it's come from. And, well, the Northern Rock's one example, but any big banking system, you know, you just have a profit motive left then, and you're disconnected from the people it affects. And I think bringing things back to local community areas is a very biblical thing, you know, to build those relationships. And actually, scientifically, it's a good idea to have local energy generation. We lose, you know, in some places you lose 30% of the electricity in transmission. Less than that in Britain, but still a lot, you know. So there's a good case for local infrastructure and local relational communities. I suspect walking to school with your kids instead of getting in your four-wheel drive and driving there, you'd have a better better well-being. And there's been studies that have shown the richer we get, the unhappier, well, our happiness doesn't increase anyway, proportionately. And you know, if we actually walk to school and talk to the neighbours outside the school gate, we might be relationally much better off than burning lots of carbon dioxide in four-wheel drives and getting cross with the kids because you're stuck in a jam. So that's straight a little bit from the market.
Yes.
You've reflected about the destruction of the present creation. As a geologist, you must have also had many times to think about the destruction of previous creations, like the destruction of the dinosaurs. I'd be interested in your own theological reflection on that. Because obviously it's not the first time that we've come very close to this.
That's true. I mean, and that, well, we went around at the time of the dinosaurs, of course. I think that's the scary thing, actually. The Earth has been hotter than it is now in the past. There were times when it was very, very hot. There's times when it was very cold. Some people even think there was what's called a snowball Earth, that the whole Earth was frozen. And interestingly, the only way they think that we got out of that was by sub-ice volcanic eruptions, which poured carbon dioxide into the air and caused global warming, which then melted the ice and things got back to normal. So, yes, the Earth has been hotter in the past, it's been colder in the past, and that's what's scary. It will do it again, there's no doubt, the Earth can do it, but humans have never experienced this before, and never experienced this rate of change that they have before. And as I say, humans are locked into territory now, very profoundly. You know, if you want to get an argument going at the pub, you know, just talk about immigration or something, you know, other people coming in, or whatever. That's what you fight real wars about, is over boundaries. So I think, yes, the Earth has done it before, and geologically I know, if you do it again, we shouldn't have any delusions about that. And in fact, there might well be some very nasty feedback mechanisms which are going to make it worse than these scenarios I've shown. For instance, they didn't factor in the fact that as ice melts, you lubricate the bottom of the glaciers with hot water so they might flow even faster. So you get positive feedbacks. That's one thing they said, we don't understand it well enough, so we won't put it in. Another thing which I'm going to seminars in my department, it's clear that the ocean is getting acidified. As it gets more acid, it has less capacity to take up carbon dioxide because some of the bugs can't live there. So, you know, there might be a feedback there that actually we put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and we have less ability to remove it. So there might be lots of what are called positive feedbacks. Things get worse a lot faster than these rather conservative estimates, actually. And so, yes, all these geological perspectives make me more worried, not less, because the Earth can do it. There's no reason it shouldn't.
But I suspect behind the question also, if I'm not mistaken, was a little bit more theological question as well, isn't there? Which I'm not sure you addressed.
Okay,
well, why does it matter that dinosaurs, does it matter theologically that the Permian extinction wiped out 98% of all species? I mean, I think that was also behind the question,
Absolutely.
Wasn't it? Yes. Yeah.
Well, you know, 98% of all species that have ever lived, not just the dinosaurs, they're the poster boys, you know, they're extinct now. And it's part of life, you know, life demands death. Every time you eat breakfast, you kill something, even if it's a lettuce, if you ate lettuce for breakfast. You know. It's the way we work in this system. There's a system of life and death going through. And actually, you know, that doesn't worry me, actually, because it seems to me that the
the life that Jesus was talking about was relationship with God. That's the thing that matters more than anything. And this physical world with all its volcanoes and earthquakes and life cycles is the way it is. And you know, some of those quotes about the lion roaring for his food and seek his prey from God, that seems to be the scheme of things. And you know, that was a good creation he made. So I hesitate to say this, but you know, we can get hung up on physical death in a way. Paul, you know, said he can't decide whether it's better for him to die now and be with the Lord or to stay here and serve you for a bit longer. And presumably he really meant that. He couldn't decide, which was a pretty finely balanced choice. So, you know, the death of many animals, that's the way it is, you know. And, I was just saying to Rodney the other day, there's a quote that Lord Tennyson, he wrote a poem called In Memoriam for actually a friend who died who had been engaged to his sister. And in that he said, it is better to have lived and have loved than never to have loved at all. You know, so, you know, in the midst of suffering, actually to experience love and have lived, even if that's cut off, may still be a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, in science, I think we were talking about this last night. I think we tend to specialise in the thing that we feel an affinity for. So personally, I would feel great grief at the thought of extinction of species because, yeah, okay, there's a cycle of death and rebirth and resurrection and all that, but actually, realistically speaking, if we lose the biodiversity that we have now, the human race is very unlikely to ever see that again. So there's an impoverishment of creation that then takes place due to mass extinction. Even if humans survive, if we lose 99% of other species, we can impoverish creation by doing that.
Absolutely. Sorry, I didn't want to give the impression that was not the case, especially when it's human agency that's causing it.
Yeah.
I mean, the case of the dinosaurs, actually, I'm quite glad they went extinct, because that's what made way for mammals, and you know, that's what eventually led to humans. So actually, we're here because the dinosaurs aren't, and presumably that was God's scheme of things. He's sovereign, so he was happy with that. But I couldn't agree with you more that if we're consciously, knowingly doing things, I mean, we're going through a mass extinction now. The rate of extinction is been estimated as perhaps 100 times higher than the normal rate would be if humans went around. Yeah.
Perhaps it's worth clarifying the extinction at the KT boundary, which wiped out the dinosaurs, was not global warming but a meteorite, most likely. I mean, would you go along with that, or there's a possibility that that was actually a meteorite?
Well, as it happens, I've written a paper on this, which is published, which says that it's just as likely it was a massive volcanic eruption in the Deccan in India, which produced 10 million cubic kilometres of volcanic rock. 10 million cubic kilometres is enough to fill this room every second for a million years. For a million years, you know, it's a huge amount. And it's at least as likely that the climate change caused the extinctions as did the impact of Chicxulub in Mexico. But in fact, both things happened very close to one another, and it looks as if, you know, it was like a double whammy. The biosphere was stressed by both. But when you look in detail, you see that the extinctions are not all happening at one horizon. There's 100 levels of them, and different things went out at different times over a period of about 700,000 years. And that doesn't look like a single impact effect. That looks more like a volcanic eruption every 10,000 years, stressing the biosphere a bit more. So actually, it was probably both, that particular KT, Cretaceous Tertiary boundary, 60 million years ago.
Could I suggest, Dennis, that we put a question in about the market for the panel tonight? You know, that would be the type of thing that perhaps could be tossed around tonight.
Yep. Any question will go in the box, and yes, open market for that. Yes, open market questions. Yes. Yes.
It's not possible actually with real application that actually we could turn things around much quicker than we think. I mean, being optimistic. I'm thinking, for example, it wasn't that long ago we were all going on about CFCs. I don't know what happened to all that story, but obviously the ozone layer all of a sudden appears that's history now. Like the smog in London, is it possible that if we really applied ourselves, we could turn this round?
Absolutely, yeah. The chlorofluorocarbons is a really interesting case because there was a convention of the United Nations in Montreal, which everybody agreed, we're going to cut these out, and they did so over a period of a few years, and it's been hailed actually by the head of the UN as the most successful international treaty ever. Yeah, and it worked, as you say. Now, it worked because it was pretty easy to do, to be honest. It's quite easy to find a substitute for a chlorofluorocarbon.
and use that instead in refrigeration and your little aerosol sprays and so on. And that's what people did. But it did work. So the issue now is, can we get people to make a similar sort of agreement over global climate change? And in principle we can. There have been agreements, Kyoto for instance, but it's notable that the biggest polluter in the world did not sign up to it because they said, I won't do anything that harms my own people's economy. Now that actually seems like a definition of sin to me. I won't do anything that harms me for the sake of others, but I mean we could discuss that offline somewhere. So in principle, yes, and I think it is actually potentially a huge opportunity to actually get the nations of the world working together. But I mean the other issue of justice is that we've got to bring down our consumption, but places like China and India, a billion people in India, ought to be allowed to bring their consumption up, so so that they have the same standard of living as us. There's no reason we should say to them, you can't have a standard of living that we have. And so there is a proposal, and probably I think it's one that Christians ought to get behind, called contraction and convergence, which means we contract and they're allowed to go up until we come to an equitable level. And the equitable level at the moment will be that every person in the world will be allowed to emit 1 ton of carbon per year. Now we're way above that. We're 15, we're 12 I think at the moment. So it's a big change. But
doesn't it also stress the importance of Christian theistic scientists like John Houghton, who I believe has done more to actually convert evangelical America than probably most people, as opposed to atheistic scientists?
Yeah, I'm into that.
Yes, this question. Yes.
There's presumably the possibility that India and China and Brazil can bring up their standard of energy use without bringing up their emission of carbon.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I had understood that, in fact, China was doing quite a lot towards that, that they were establishing massive solar fields with solar panels. And is that true?
No, I wish that were true. No.
But I also hear that they're building a power station a week.
They are, they're building a huge coal-fired power station a week.
Yeah.
And the issue is you'll sometimes read that we're at peak oil, that we've used half the oil there is, and that's about right. So I'm sure we'll burn the other half, but that'll be dead and gone then, that's not an issue. But there is enough coal for 400 years, so we'll be burning coal for hundreds of years at the present rate. And that's a really dirty fuel. More carbon, but also produces particulates and all sorts of horrible stuff. And a lot of people die. I mean, thousands of people globally die every year from coal mining. So I suspect we need a mix of energy sources, which might include nuclear. I know many Christians are opposed to it, but actually nuclear is a lot safer than coal in terms of deaths. And interestingly, if you look at, there's a coal-fired power station just outside Oxford called, what's it called? Didcot, yes. And that actually puts more radiation into the atmosphere than Doomray, which is a nuclear power station. Just because coal's got, it's got some radiation trapped in it, and that goes up the flue. I mean, that's a really interesting statistic, isn't it? So there are other sources of energy. Possibly nuclear is one of them, wind, solar, all these other things. But I mean, the issue with coal is, I'm sure we'll burn it because it's there. But the technical response is that if we burn it in a power station and capture the carbon dioxide as it comes out of the flue, and then pump it back underground, it's out of the way. So we've got the energy, we haven't put the pollution into the atmosphere. And interestingly, Britain's in a fantastic position because we've got all this North Sea oil infrastructure. We've got pipelines going from storage barrels underground, which have stored oil for 100 million years. They don't leak. We've got pipes going all the way to land. If we get a move on, we'll be able to pump stuff back down again. But if we leave it 10 years, all the pipes will go rusty. And that'll be the end of that. So, it's interesting moments.
And is somebody taking that into consideration? Are they really going to utilise the structure?
Well, yes. People are working on, it's called carbon sequestration. People are working on that. There are pilot projects in the USA. There's one in China, which has British scientists involved in. I mean, an interesting sideline is, I think it was BP, we're going to do one off the north of Scotland into the, I've forgotten the field now, begins with them, to do exactly this. And actually they've just pulled out of it and they've just cancelled it. And the interesting reason is the political one, that there's no laws in place to pump stuff underground. That there's laws about extracting stuff from the ground, there's not any laws about putting stuff into the ground, and they couldn't do it legally. or at least there was not the legal cover. You know, they might have been illegal and they might have been sued if there's an accident and all that, so they pulled out of it. So actually it's an interesting political issue just for the legislation there. I mean, in principle, we ought to be able to do it, and it's been estimated that if you did it on coal, you would increase the price of electricity at your home by about 20%. So instead of being 10p, it'd be 12p. And you know, that's not a big price to pay, considering electricity has doubled in the past 18 months or something.
Thank you.
Okay, we've got time for one last quick question. Otherwise, I think we'll break for tea. I think we'll. Okay, this is a good one. Yes.
Just a quick one then. Just
yes.
occurred to me. I mean, in terms of what we're prepared to give up, a lot of our medieval church buildings are incredibly energy inefficient. Should we actually be prepared just to walk away on ecological grounds?
Well, I think on the community centre grounds, you should not give up a church building, because I've been involved in a couple of church plants into new areas, and it's you know, somewhere to meet is quite an interesting thing. But maybe we should put in some ceiling. Actually, I mean, there's a couple of churches in Cambridge that put in a ceiling like this, and you actually end up with 2 rooms. You have a community room upstairs and a meeting room downstairs, and it's warmer, uses less energy, and it's more useful. So, and the only thing that stops that, to be honest, is organisations like Christian Heritage, who actually ban you changing things.
English Heritage.
English, sorry, what did I say?
You said Christian Heritage.
Christian, oh no, English Heritage, sorry, oh I should, no, sorry Christian Heritage, no, English Heritage, who stop you doing that sort of thing. In completely ignoring the fact that most churches are a complete smorgasbord of things being tacked on and added through the centuries. That's part of their glory, I think, you know, you see the little side chapel and the font and there's something else from different ages. So, I mean, absolutely, we should be bold in doing these things, and we should take on English heritage if that's what needs doing, you know, on their own grounds, to make them, you know, to make buildings living community buildings, not just museum pieces.
We had a fire a year ago, 2 years ago, and by regulation we had to put in better insulation.
Yeah.
We took the opportunity to double glaze the building. It is a 1936 building, so it's got advantages over us.
Excellent. Can be done.
Okay, well, I think we'll first of all thank Bob very much. We worked him very much.